Well, thanks very much, Blake, and I want to thank Uncle Alan for the welcome to country and also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. I want to acknowledge JD and the coaching staff, Blake and Nick, head of the management of South Sydney, and also AJ, Alex Johnson representing the players here today, and other people as part of this wonderful South Sydney community. It is wonderful to be here at the spiritual home of South Sydney. More than 50 years ago, I used to sit with my mum up in that far corner and watch my heroes run around. My heroes in those days were people like Eric Sims, now one of my constituents in the electorate of Grainler. My mum sewed on to the back of my South Sydney football jumper the number 1 to represent one of certainly the best goal kicker I've ever seen and one of the greatest players I've ever seen. It was a great South Sydney team in those days. But when you sat on the hill here at Redfern Oval in about 1970 and around that time, the recognition of Indigenous Australians and their role as the oldest continuous culture on earth was not always given the respect that it deserved. It was a rough place, the hill at Redfern Oval, including a rough place when it came to comments that were made about racial issues. Australia's come a long way. Now, when we have the acknowledgement of country prior to the NRL Grand Final, the AFL Grand Final and other events, what we have is respect. Respect in this nation of the great privilege that we have of sharing this continent with the oldest continuous culture on earth. But that still is not reflected in our nation's founding document. Our nation's founding document, written as it was back in the lead up to 1901 by the men who gathered, chose to put in that constitution a clause to allow New Zealand to join as a state of Australia, but didn't mention the fact that our history did not begin in 1788 when the first fleet arrived here. That makes it an incomplete document, and we need to acknowledge that as a nation. And we are giving Australians over the next 7 days the opportunity to write the next chapter in the Australian story, a chapter that acknowledges our history, a chapter that also acknowledges that we still have been unsuccessful in closing the gap in so many areas. Only 4 out of 19 closing the gap targets are currently on track to be met. So we need to do something different. For 122 years, Canberra has made decisions on behalf of Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Australians gathered at Uluru in 2017, and after being requested by the former coalition government to determine what form recognition should take, they decided that they wanted recognition with substance, something that would leave a lasting legacy, something that would make a practical difference, to close the gap when we have an 8-year life expectancy gap, when we have gaps in education and health and housing, where there's a greater chance of a young Indigenous male today going to jail than to university. We need to do better. So this referendum is about just 2 things. One, recognising the fact of our history, the fact that our history goes back some 65,000 years, and acknowledging that, acknowledging the first peoples of this land. And the second is the form of that should be simply a non-binding advisory committee. Nothing to fear here, just a committee able to make representations to government, and then Parliament and government still being the decision maker. but Indigenous Australians being able to be listened to for their views. And I want to congratulate South Sydney, consistent with their fine history that they have, particularly in recent years, with their engagement with South Cares, for the process they've entered into here of listening to Indigenous players, community members and supporters before arriving at this decision that they're declaring today. Because when we listen to people, we get better outcomes, because you get buy-in and you also get engagement and greater efficiency. There'll be less waste if decisions are made with input from Indigenous Australians. We want to do things with Indigenous Australians rather than for them or to them. It's an important distinction. And that's what this referendum is about. The opportunity that we are giving every Australian with one vote, one value, to write yes. Everything to gain and nothing to lose. So after this today, I'll be heading to Marrickville Town Hall to cast my vote today for yes. Because I know that we need to do better. And that's why people who've examined this proposal, whether they be the faith groups that myself and Rachel Perkins met with on Thursday, the faith leaders of the Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, Uniting Church, Greek Orthodox Church, Islamic community, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, all of the faith groups, major faith groups in Australia, all advocating a yes vote. The sporting codes, National Rugby League, AFL, Tennis Australia, Cricket Australia, Rugby, all advocating a yes vote. Community-based organisations, ACOS, the Salvation Army, other groups, all advocating a yes vote. The people I've been with, yesterday I was in 3 states, people in Brisbane, people in Lakemba, people in Shepparton, people in Wangaratta, all coming together to take up this opportunity. And the alternative is not one. The alternative is just more of the same. The alternative is keeping things the same, no, which leads us nowhere. We need to do better. I thank South Sydney for their advocacy. I thank South Sydney for the ongoing work they're doing practically on the ground with South Cares and their engagement particularly with Indigenous young people to provide them with pathways and with opportunity. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity. This is the first referendum that's been held this century. They don't come around that often. So I do urge people to vote yes in the coming 7 days, and I'd ask Rachel Perkins to now follow me.